Quick and sweet. Have a seat, everybody. All right, good morning. I was going to get down there closer to everybody, but then I realized the girls can't even see me through the projector, so I moved back up here. Okay. So much stuff to cover. What I really want to talk about, and I'm going to give you the first slide, is the wonder of God. Now, you guys are in a Christian school, and I know you've heard a lot about creation, and all the stuff that goes with the pledge to Christianity and the pledge to the Bible and all the things that we can learn about both God and creation. I think a lot of times, and I know it's true with me, we kind of get lost in the details. We get lost in all the moral stuff of the Bible and all the history of the Bible. We get lost in the busyness of the world. And as you get out into college and you have a job, God is left out of the thinking of all the people around you. And it's so easy to lose the absolute awe of what God has done, both personally as our Savior, but as the creator of everything. So I'm going to take you into the inner workings of a cell and then into the vast expanse of space and try to just build in you this unbelievable wonder of what God has done. Now, I can't even begin to scratch the surface of it all. I've written 8 books on the evidence for creation from science. In case you don't know, my background is science. I'm a scientist. I've worked for almost 30 years for the Dow Chemical Company, developed 18 new patented products, which resulted in different things that Dow made, insulation products, new building kind of materials, things that have been used in automobiles. One of my products has been used in the International Space Station, made millions of dollars for the company, and I didn't get any of that money. So, but every time I got a patent, they would give us a silver dollar. But you're paid to do your job, whatever your job is. That's the way it works. So you do the best you can. I love science, and I know very well how it works. Now, we're going to start, actually by just looking at, let me make sure I get the right video, because I'm doing this is the senior high group. We're just going to look at one creature that God made. We're going to start by looking at an animal that he made. And we're going to think about the 2 possibilities that are thrown out there for why this animal existed. Last night, I spent a lot of time talking about, if you think of the whole universe as a box, like I am holding the universe in my hand, okay? All the stars and the space, the matter, the energy. Inside the box, in this box, it's a jewelry box. There's various necklaces and crafted things. Those are like the animals. Either they made themselves or they've been created. I mean, that's it. And whenever you hear this word evolution, one way it's used is that things vary. They have variety. They adapt. Bacteria adapt. Bacteria can grab bits and pieces of DNA from another bacteria and modify themselves in order to adapt to an environment. It's an amazing process, but what you're not told, that ability is programmed into the bacteria. It didn't just happen randomly. It's programmed to do these things. Dogs adapt and have all sorts of variety. People have all sorts of variety. And that evolution is used to show, hey, look at evolution. It shows that things adapt. Absolutely true. But then the word's used to mean one animal could just turn into a completely different animal with new abilities and new body structures. And that's never been observed. Let me show you one little animal as we start to look at the wonder of God. Now, this is a little fish. It's only about that big, about 6 inches. It's called a puffer fish, the Japanese puffer fish. But it does something no other creature in the entire creation can do, not even close. Watch this little video of the puffer fish.
This small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab females' attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He plows the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the ridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment and must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation.
What a bummer. It's skipping and stopping. Playback error. Okay, well, hang on a second. What I'm going to do is go to the root file. Okay, we're going to come on. Okay, we were probably about
These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the ridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. Nowhere else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Okay, now I want to just talk about a couple things. The absolute wonder of that should be mind-blowing. That fish is only about 6 inches long, okay? If it was as big as us, that sculpture that it just created, sculpture, is about 6 foot in diameter. It would be like you or me taking our hands in our heads and shoving around mounds of sand 24 hours a day for 7 days, nonstop, never stopping, and creating an absolute perfect circle from here all the way up to the road onto the other side of the road without ever getting up above it to look to see if it's perfectly circular. The fish never swims up to see what it's making. The plan is in its head. Now, how did that happen? How in the world could some fish who didn't know how to make that perfect structure, that absolute gorgeous beauty, somehow develop that ability, just a little push of a piece of sand at a time? It could never happen. Furthermore, at the very end, that's David Attenborough. He does all these nature films, this English scientist with the authoritative English accent. He says, if this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will. Now, why does he say that? Because he's been trained to think the box made itself. Evolution is an absolute fact. Everything came from something else. So how do you explain that a fish could do this or even want to do this? You have to come up with a story, something that fits into your evolution thinking. So they say, well, he must be making this beautiful sculpture so that he can attract some babe fish that will then fertilize eggs and they'll lay the eggs there. Well, why does it have to be so beautiful? Why does it have to be perfectly circular? Why can't it just be some mound? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have to be. And you hear this all the time. You'll hear it all through life. Evolution, that dolphins evolved from some sort of a land animal and their legs slowly disappeared as some sort of a cow creature crawled into the ocean, and its nose migrated to the top of its head and its legs disappeared as it formed this absolute perfect structure of a marine mammal, whales and fish and seals, because they figured they had to have evolved much later, not early. After mammals formed on the land, they went back into the ocean. And they adapted. Well, there's no proof of any of that. They find little structures they say must have been left over from the land. Well, they have other purposes. It's a story to explain the box made itself. And don't buy into the lie, because it's just a story and a lie. Furthermore, when we test it, it always has issues. You hear the same thing. Whoops, let me go back to my PowerPoint slides. Pull them back up. With things like the ostrich, absolute gorgeous beauty. Why does there have to be so much beauty in nature? There doesn't. I heard the story growing up as I went to school. The reason especially things like the ostrich are so beautiful is because it helps attract the female. The guy shows his absolute gorgeous manliness, beauty, in this case, and the female will pick him. The hen will pick him. So they tested it. They had a whole bunch of ostriches, females, in an area, and then they would send in a male that they'd cut off all the beautiful colors off of its tail. So it was pug ugly. Then they sent in an ostrich with all its gorgeous feathers. And they did it a bunch of times, and they figured out, will the female pick the pretty ostrich, or will the female pick the ugly ostrich? Guess what? Didn't make a bit of difference. The beauty made no difference in which one would be picked. So when they tested their idea that beauty's here because of evolution, it failed. It shows it doesn't matter. The beauty is there because God is behind it. Don't forget these things as you go through life and you're fed this lie that it all just made itself. Because when we test it, it doesn't work out. Now, I'm going to spend the biggest part of this morning talking about the design of DNA, because it just should blow our mind like nothing else. Now, we think of DNA as, my goodness, I'm having a lot of problems with my slides this morning. It's just a book. That's kind of the way it's presented to us. You watch the CSI specials and all the people looking for the guy who did the murder. They find a little bit of DNA and they track it back because it has a certain code, a certain pattern, and they can track it right back to the person it came from. That's kind of what we all know about DNA. It's kind of a code. But it is like nothing else in the universe. There is no information containing system that comes even remotely close. And even in the last 10 years, we found out stuff about DNA that just blows scientists and geneticists' minds that they've never could have even remotely imagined. Went to a conference at Cornell University where they talked about information. Where does information come from? Now, these are all PhD information scientists, geneticists, but they all came from an angle of believing in God instead of leaving God out. If you leave God out, you have to assume information creates itself. But there's never been an example of that in all of human observation or experimentation. Information always comes from an intelligent source. But if you look at DNA, it's not just a book. And let me back up a second. The entire genetic code of a creature like a human being, and by the way, we're not a creature, we are a separate creation, different than any other created animal in the entire animal kingdom. We shouldn't even be classified along with animals, we're so different. And I'll talk about that before I'm done with, even our DNA shows that. But our entire coded information in every cell is called the genome, and it's like a library filled with books, okay? Imagine an entire library. Chromosomes are like sections of that library, the biography section, the adventure section, the nonfiction section, the romance section, whole bunches of books. An individual gene, and there's about 23 chromosomes that make up our DNA. There's about 20,000 genes that make up our DNA. They're like a single book in that library, or sometimes a chapter of a book in the library. So that gives you the concept of what DNA is and how it's organized. But this is the thing that was never really understood until a few years ago. The information in DNA is so compact that it can be read to create proteins and parts of our molecules and parts of our bodies, both forwards and backwards. For example, if you look at a single word like this, it has a meaning. It carries a meaning. We immediately know, God. But if you then spell it backwards, it has a totally different meaning. Still a usable word. It can be spelled forward, it can be spelled backwards, to have two different meanings. Now this is what DNA does, but in a really amazing way. Another example. Wow. I've never had my computer do this. My goodness. It just totally locked up. Okay. We'll try restarting it. Sorry about that. I tested this morning before I left, went through all the slides, went through all the transitions. They all worked perfectly. While it's starting up, I'll just go on to the things, even though the slides are much more visual. If you look at the word dessert, D-E-S-S-E-R-T, that means has one meaning forwards. If you spell it backwards, if you can think about it in your mind, it ended with an S, the next letter was a T, the next letter was an E, then there's two S's. It actually spells stressed. Dessert forwards, stressed backwards. Pretty long word, but it has two completely different meanings in two different directions. So that's what DNA does, except, zip on down. Desserts forwards, stressed backwards. Except DNA does it with entire chapters of a book. Now, get the concept here. Now, remember, we're looking at the wonder of what God has been able to do. Imagine that you have a job at Microsoft, and they've come up with a new cell phone, and you get a call from your boss, and he says, okay, you've been the lead of this project. I want you to write the manual of how to assemble this phone so the people on the production floor can get all the parts and assemble it, and just line by line, you're explaining to them exactly how the phone is assembled. And you say, well, I can do that. It'll take me a week or so, but I'll have the manual ready for you. And your boss says, yeah, but we want to save paper. So I would like you to design those instructions so that when we send this phone out, we can send the same instruction manual out to everybody who are using the phone. And by reading that manual backwards, starting with the last letter, and then reading each word and each sentence and each paragraph backwards, they can then know exactly how to operate that phone. What would you tell your boss? What do you just sit there and look at him? There we go. You tell your boss he's crazy, because it is absolutely humanly impossible to design such a book. The most powerful supercomputer in the world running indefinitely could never produce such a book or such a language. That's exactly what DNA is. And that's just one example of what goes on. The DNA structure, the letters, the coded information, it creates certain proteins, certain little molecular machines when it's read forwards, but then it can be read backwards to create completely different structures and little molecular machines, all in that same section. But then it has overlapping information. For instance, if you're just reading along the letters of DNA to create a certain protein, like you're reading a sentence, it might come across a sentence that sounds like this. I like chocolate that evening. It's like, wow, that seems to be a mistake. What in the world is that saying? Well, this is what it's saying. One part of exactly that same section of DNA says, I like chocolate. Well, that makes sense. It's a perfectly logical, reasonable statement. But the same little bit of information, when you line it up in a different way, says later that evening. So you've compacted two completely different functions and meanings in the same set of letters just by selecting which parts you want to use. It overlaps the word late. So God has designed a language that can overlap the same sequence in order to create two different meanings in that same section, overlapping information. And then God puts spliced information into that same DNA sequence. I like chocolate that evening. So now, by signaling little molecular machines that will come and grab certain parts of that exact same set of sequenced letters, they might just grab those particular letters instead of the beginning and reading it right on through and then starting somewhere else and reading right on through. They grab spliced information out of the DNA to create a completely different message. I like her hat. See, it's the same set of letters that created three completely different pieces of information, all contained in the same little area. Now, think about what we're told about evolution. Evolution means that information on DNA, that sequence of letters, all happened randomly. And if those sequence of letters had a useful function or purpose, then DNA used them to create some animal or some part of an animal. But to create the next animal, you have to randomly change the letters, and it has to have a useful purpose for the next animal. Well, if I randomly change, like just the E, and turn it into some other letter, not only do I destroy part of this information, I also destroy the information needed to create the other two messages, because I've destroyed all three chemicals. So when you do a random change by evolution with DNA, you not only have to change one protein, you have to not destroy all the other proteins contained in that same area. Start to see how impossible evolution is. It's not just, you don't just randomly change something to create one new thing. You're destroying all the other things. And then there is embedded information that I'm not even going to get into, and encrypted information. And DNA is bent and folded so that you can grab information from the three-dimensional structure of how it's laid out. Now, one more little example. I use this zipper to kind of represent DNA. It's kind of twisted in a three-dimensional structure. There's 4 different colors of the chemicals that line up to carry the information. See, the English language has 26 letters. We assign meanings to how those letters are arranged. That's what DNA does. Morse code just has a dot, a dash, and a space. Digital language has a 0 and a 1, and the meaning we assign to them determines a purpose and a function. It's exactly what DNA does with 4 letters. But how do you get the information off of DNA? We're going to talk more about little molecular machines, probably later today or tomorrow, that DNA makes called proteins. But to get the information off of DNA, it's tightly bonded. You have to unzip it. And then the 2 strands separate. Other little molecular machines come. They line up to create what's called an RNA molecule. It's like a negative. It's the inverse information. So it will grab like a green, a red, yellow, 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 red, green, red, yellow, 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 like a million times a second. It just zips down through here and copies the information. But to get the information to make the proteins, it has to separate the DNA. And then when it's done grabbing the information, this little molecular machine, like analogous to the zipper pull, closes the DNA back up again. So it's protected and it doesn't just randomly disintegrate. So you got to unzip it to make the proteins. Can't get a protein any other way. And then you got to zip it back up when you're done. Now, the only way to unzip DNA is if you have exactly the right sequence of information to make this little molecular machine, this little protein called the zipper pull. It's the only way to get the information. But the only way to make the protein is to unzip the DNA. So you can't unzip the DNA until you have the protein, but you can't make the protein until you unzip the DNA. Are you starting to follow what I'm saying here? You can't make the protein until you unzip it, but you can't unzip it to make the protein. You kind of go round and round in a circle. It's kind of like that old riddle, what came first, the chicken or the egg that's inside of the chicken? There's a little egg with a yolk. You can't get a chicken until you have an egg. How can you get a chicken if there was no egg to make the chicken? But how do you make the egg if you didn't have the chicken to make the egg? It's an insolvable riddle unless you realize they both had to have been made simultaneously. The first chicken, the first bird that ever came into existence had to already have the eggs inside of it, or there could never be another bird. You see what God does, the wonder of God. He shows us by studying creation, everything had to be made at once. You can't even make the simplest structure of a cell. You can't even make the DNA to allow other parts of a single bacteria to be made unless it's all there at once. The proteins to unzip it had to be made at the same time the DNA was made. Nobody's ever solved these kind of problems. They're just ignored by people who believe in evolution. Their faith is in some future discovery. So it is the most compact information-containing system in the universe. Nothing comes close to the amount of information contained in DNA. How compact? If you look at this picture, there's a little teaspoon filled with grains of salt, okay? The amount of DNA in your body, we have 100 trillion cells. If you pull the DNA out of one of those cells, it's so small you can't even begin to see it. But if you were to gather it all up, it wouldn't even fill a single teaspoon. That amount of DNA corresponds to a stack of books that goes all the way to the moon and back 500 times. 500 times to the moon and back. Just the information in one of our bodies. Now, when I talk about numbers like that, we tend to lose the awe of God because it's incomprehensible. I didn't even realize how far away the moon was in actual understandable terms. So I'm going to show a little video. Now we're going to move from the microscopic stuff God has made to the absolute scope and expanse of what God has made. I'll show you a little film about how far away is the moon? How big are these things like the solar system? And I can't even begin to talk about the universe, so we're just going to deal with the solar system. Again, I want to run a little video on how far is it from the moon and back in a stack of books that would go all that distance. Now, again, I'm going to, instead of using the embedded videos, which seem to get me in trouble, I'm going to go to the source video. I'm going to run the one called The Solar System to Scale.
If you look up an image of the Earth and Moon, you're going to get a picture where they're quite close together. Something like that. But in reality, the Earth and Moon are about that far apart. That is the Earth and the Moon to scale.
Imagine a stack of books all the way there 500
Taking the
times.
same concept, but for the solar system, every single picture of the solar system that we ever encounter is not to scale. If you put the orbits to scale on a piece of paper, the planets become microscopic and you won't be able to see them. The only way to see a scale model of the solar system is to build one. Welcome to Black Rock Desert. We have 36 hours to measure the distances, trace out the orbits, and set up a time-lapse shot from up on top of a nearby mountain. To create a scale model with an Earth only as big as this marble, you need 7 miles of empty space. At this scale, the sun is 1.5 meters, so about that big around. So we are driving right now to Mercury, and we've arrived. Venus is the same size as Earth. There's a world in my pocket somewhere. And Earth. And this is Mars. Got a couple of robots rolling around on that one. Once the time-lapse is ready, we'll drive each orbit with a light. Hopefully, you'll be able to tell just how big they really are. Onward to the outer planets. Jupiter. Saturn. That tiny light out there is our sun, just over a mile away. The sun's way, way out there now. This is it. This is the edge of the solar system. So if we've made our model correctly, your perspective from where Earth is on the model will match your perspective from standing on the real Earth. So if you look back at the sun, you will see that the model sun and the real sun are the exact same size. And that's how you can tell that the proportions are correct. There are 24 people in the entire history of the human species, billions of people, who have actually seen the full circle of the Earth with their own eyes.
Following the breakfast, the astronauts went to the suit room where they donned their spacesuits.
This is man's attempt to get to the moon.
0. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51.
In Earth orbit, the horizon is just slightly curved. When you head on out to the moon, that horizon slowly curves around and upon itself, and all of a sudden you're looking at something that is very strange, but it is very, very familiar.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. Wow, is that pretty?
You can put your thumb up, and you can hide the Earth behind your thumb. Everything that you've ever known, all behind your thumb.
Not any bigger than that, way up there.
It's really beautiful. You can cry.
That's what I really wanted to try and capture. We are on a marble floating in the middle of nothing. When you sort of come face to face with that, it's staggering.
Now, lose the wonder of what you guys just saw. Only 24 people have ever been out to the moon in the 1968 to 1972. Those are the astronauts that they were filming, that were still alive, that were talking about it. And if the Earth is the size of that marble, the scope of just our solar system is just incredible. And think about who Jesus is. He made it all. We're going to talk in a second about could it have made itself? Because we're all told the planets made themselves. A whole bunch of chunks were floating around the sun about 5 billion years ago, and the chunks slowly coalesced to form the planet Earth. Well, that's actually absolutely impossible. When we model it, when we mathematically model a whole bunch of little pieces being pulled together by gravity, you're going to see in a second with a demonstration, it can't work, and it doesn't work. It's taught as if it's fact, because the world around us is bent on explaining and believing the box made itself, life made itself, DNA wrote itself. It couldn't happen. Every experiment we show in these kind of areas show it doesn't. Doesn't mean there aren't scientific principles, but the scientific principles show us it couldn't happen. And the God who made all of this, the earth in all its beauty, the pufferfish in its magnificent creativity, the DNA code in its complexity. He made the whole universe. He came to earth as a human being and died in our place because we don't deserve to live with him forever. You know, I know you guys hear this over and over and over and over and over again, and it just becomes, oh, well, it's Jesus this. It's phenomenal in the awe of it. Don't lose the awe of who God is and what he's done. It's why we're trying to have these conferences and show you this kind of stuff. Now, let's talk about this kind of picture. You Google it, formation of the solar system, you see it everywhere in hundreds, if not thousands of pictures. But that's all they are, is pictures. No scientist can go back in time. And when we do the mathematical modeling, yeah, in space, if you have a couple dust particles and there's nothing else near them and they're moving along at the same speed, gravity will tend to attract them. And they'll start to coalesce and form little clumps. But once they reach a certain size, when they bump together, the momentum will never allow them to just stick. If they're infinitesimally a little bit different in speed, they'll just bounce apart like pool balls on a pool table. They don't just start to form bigger and bigger clumps. We know this when we do the modeling. Now we're going to just do an experiment and test it. Got a couple planetoids here, okay? I need two people that are really good at catching and throwing, like you're going to catch something very gently. Two volunteers. There's one. Okay, here's another. You two, okay? Come on up here. We're going to try to form a planet from two smaller little chunks. I thought I saw you raise your hand. It was a little timid raise of a hand, but okay. All right, right up here. One of you are going to position yourself right here. The other one over here, okay? Here's your little planetoid floating around the sun, lots of little chunks, but imagine there's about 100 million of these chunks. Okay, you're going to get the other planetoid. Going to toss them toward each other at the same time, and you have to catch them, and catch them gently, because we don't want our little planetoids falling apart, okay? But you're going to try to get them to hit and connect in space. Okay, so start tossing them back and forth and gently catch them. Throw them at the same time. So get ready to throw at the same time and make sure you catch them. Okay, but you got to get them to hit, because if they don't hit, they're not going to stick together. They're floating around the sun. So throw them at the same time, trying to get it at the same level and get them to hit. Go ahead. Nope. Oh, lost part of your planetoid. Pick up the bigger piece. Don't worry about the little pieces. Okay, wow, hit something hard. It didn't stick. Okay, keep going. Get them to hit in midair. Okay, guys, you're losing your planets. It's supposed to be getting bigger. All right, keep going. Back and forth. Oh, did you see them stick? They hit. Did they stick together? Now imagine in space around the sun, these things, go ahead and sit down. Thank you, guys. 4 tries, good attempt. Just drop it. We'll clean up the mess later. I like to make messes. Imagine they're not just moving around. Those guys are throwing those at maybe 2 or 3 miles per hour. That's about the speed that we're going. When we're forming the solar system by evolutionary processes, we've got 1 billion supposed chunks, and they're moving at 20 to 100,000 miles per hour. And they're all just spinning around the sun, and every once in a while one of them's going to bump together. Is it going to stick? No. See, what you're told about evolution whether it's cosmic evolution, whether it's the planets, whether it's the DNA code, whether it's chemicals coming together to form life, it's all a lie. Develop a lie detector that's going to go beep, beep, beep when you hear this stuff. And you're going to be told the scientists have shown that it's true. Probe a little deeper. Have they run an experiment? Have they seen things floating around and forming together and coalescing? No, it's all just mathematical manipulation, making absolutely impossible assumptions. And then if you look at the entire universe, it is filled with billions and trillions times trillions of stars and galaxies. And it makes our solar system smaller than a grain of sand all the way to Uranus. Just our galaxy is that kind of scope of distance. Now, could a single star even have formed itself? God said, I made the stars in the first chapter of Genesis. Didn't say they made themselves. See, there's certain things he did. He said, I made life, very different forms of life, 10 times in the very first chapter of his revelation to mankind, which I think was given to Adam and made it all the way to Noah, which made it all the way to Moses, who wrote it down. He said he made different kinds of creatures to reproduce after their own kind. That's the opposite of any sort of possible evolution. But let's look at stars. Stars are a big ball of gas, okay? Hydrogen gas. It is packed so tightly together that the forces of gravity pushing in on all that gas fuses the hydrogen together in the middle of a star. It's like, that's what a hydrogen bomb is. When you fuse hydrogen with hydrogen, it forms nuclear fusion. It transfers the hydrogen into helium and releases all sorts of light and heat, energy, just emanating from the star. That means it's burning up its fuel. That's what's happening. It's transforming matter into energy. The energy is released and the star slowly disappears. Now, it's really efficient, so stars will last for billions of years, hundreds of millions to billions of years. But most of the stars in the universe are not big enough that they could possibly be as old as we're told the universe is. They should be long ago disappeared if the universe is 10 to 15 billion years old. There shouldn't be near the stars we see, but there are. Even in our galaxy, they should all be gone, but they're still there. So what are you going to do? If you've been trained, evolution's a fact, millions of years, billions of years, you look out and you see all these stars, but they shouldn't be there because they should have long ago burned up their fuel. The only option left, if you still want to leave God out, if you still don't want to believe he made things, the only option is to believe stars are remaking themselves. And that's what you'll see. Again, if I had an hour to do nothing but astronomy, I'd show you these films from like Cosmos and National Geographic and all these Stephen Hawking specials. And all of them say gravity pulls gas together, gets that hydrogen packed tighter and tighter and tighter until stars burst into nuclear fusion. And stars are forming themselves all over the universe, even as we sit here today. And you're going to be told that's a fact, a scientific fact. Well, is it or isn't it? Remember, all your life you're going to be told stuff. And people are going to sound really positive, and they're going to sound really authoritative. But you have to ask the question, how do they know? Is it a fact or not? See, I assumed it was true. Even after I'd become a Christian, even after I'd studied creation for a decade or more, I just assumed it was true because I'd been told it over and over and over again. Until an astronomer, a man who worked at NASA all his life, who became a Christian, started to explain some things to me I didn't realize. I mean, here's a kid who went to Astro Camp. He's been trained to think, evolution's a fact, cosmic evolution's a fact. That chart I showed you is like the evolution of stars. Big gas clouds turn into big stars, little gas clouds turn into little stars. He has the same thing on the back of his sweatshirt. He's been trained to think in this way. And if nobody ever explains anything else to him, he's just going to assume it's true the rest of his life. Except there's a law of science called the universal gas law. Universal means there's never been exception. It's true everywhere in the universe because this is how science operates. And it says gas always moves from low pressure to high pressure out to low pressure. It always spreads out. Every observation ever done, every experiment ever done, every test ever done throughout humanity, throughout scientific laboratories, always shows the same thing. Gas never packs itself tighter and tighter and tighter together all by itself. We have to force it to do so with compressors and all sorts of technology. If you just leave it alone, it spreads out. In outer space, it's a vacuum. There's nothing to contain gas and force it together. It's going to spread out. I mean, this is what science does. It does experiments. There's gas packed in this can tightly together, high pressure. There's gas in this room spread out, low pressure. The only thing separating the two is a valve. So when I open the valve, for a star to form, it would be exactly like all the gas molecules deciding gravity should pull them closer, and they should start packing themselves down inside the can. So to learn what's the truth, we do experiments. We open the valve and we see what way does the gas go. And you can see it spreads out. There's never an exception. It always happens that way. It's how creation operates. And it's how God commands us. The very first command of God was to take dominion over creation. That means to study, understand, and control it. That is science. Why? First, so we can appreciate what he's done. And second, so we can learn from it and benefit from it. That's what science is all about. But there's certain things we learn that show us only God could have done it. Only God could have made a star. And then we use observation. Science is all about observation. We have used the Hubble Space Telescope to look at the universe for about 30 years now. It's up above the atmosphere, so it's really, really good at seeing really, really far. So we can look at a piece of space, like imagine that grain of salt, and I hold it at the length of my hand against the night sky, and I find a really dark spot. And then I point the Hubble telescope at that spot where I don't see any stars. They did this, they had to photograph for about a week, hold that telescope and look at that little grain of sand spot for a week. And when they did that, this is what they saw. That dark little spot of sky was filled with millions of not just stars, but entire galaxies. So far out the light was invisible to the naked eye. And they're all there, and we can't explain a single one. Because we've come back and we've taken that same photograph 10 years later, or we'll look at parts of our own galaxy and take a photograph and take another photograph 10 years later. There's not a single picture anywhere in all of outer space where 10 years ago there wasn't a star and today there is a star. We've never seen even a single star form. And yet, if evolution's true, we think there's about 100 billion galaxies, like the Milky Way, and each of them have about 100 billion stars. That's 10 with 22 zeros. Even if you divide it by 10 billion years, and they're all burning themselves up, so they all have to be remaking themselves, every second we should see 10,000 stars forming. The next second, there ought to be 10,000 new stars appearing. The next second, there ought to be 10,000 new stars appearing. Even in our own galaxy, every year we see on average 25 stars disappearing by supernovas exploding. And we've never seen a single star form. And the laws of science say they can't form because the gas is spreading out. And when we observe nebulas and gas clouds, they're always spreading out. They're never compacting in. You understand? God has made the truth absolutely obvious. The scope and size of the universe shows he had to have made it. The absolute awe and wonder of the amount of information in DNA shows he had to have made it. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the molecular machines tomorrow, but real quick in the last 2 minutes, I just want to mention this one. Inside of most bacteria, there are little like hairs that hang out of the back of them that allow the bacteria to spin them so it can swim around. Scientists spent 20 years trying to figure out how does that bacteria get that little, what's called a cilia, it's just a fancy name for a microscopic hair, to spin. And they spin at 10,000 RPM, incredibly fast. They can stop in 1/4 turn and reverse and spin the other direction. So this is a really, really incredible motor. The motor that spins this little hair at the back of this bacteria, it runs out into curves so it whips around, is made up of about 40 different parts. The parts are called proteins. They're an arrangement of other little molecules in an exact order to form an exact shape, to form an exact function. So inside of this bacteria are little motors. Now tomorrow I'm going to talk more about that. But first I want you to just get the scope of it. Imagine the biggest desert that you can ever imagine, filled with sand, okay? And then look at a single grain of sand on your fingertip. These little electric motors, exactly like the motor on a fan, are so small you could put edge to edge to edge to edge, 10,000 of them across a single grain of sand. 10,000 electric motors on a single grain of sand. That's how small they are inside of these bacteria. Humanity, with all of its intelligence, can't even begin to make anything that small. A functioning machine that small. They just have to copy what's already there and has been made by God. That's the first lecture. I'm going to be talking to you 3 more times. We're going to hit geology. I'm going to continue to talk about the complexity of life and how it could have come about. But don't lose the wonder. Don't fool yourself that it could have ever made itself, because the whole world's trying to get you to head in that direction and believe it. And if you don't always feel God, you don't always feel that internal wonder of what he's done for us personally. But by looking at creation, you can't miss it unless you choose to harden yourself and harden your mind and harden your heart to the point where you're just blind to it. It is everywhere around us. So I hope I kind of laid some groundwork for the rest of what we'll talk about this week. And I hope you start to get a better appreciation for what God has done. Thanks. That's all I had to share this morning.